Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to zombies. But, as always, we have to get there. Just a reminder, the DIY rabbit hole class starts next week, so this week is your last chance to sign up. Go to creativejudaism.com/DIY. Also, one note before we start, there's going to be a lot of discussion of death in this episode, so if that's something that you're sensitive to, you might want to skip this one. Alright, let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshah Emor, starts off with a bunch of laws for Kohanim, the descendants of Aaron who do all the sacrifice stuff in the temple. And one of those laws is that Kohanim are not allowed to knowingly make themselves become tameh, ritually impure, through contact or proximity with a dead body.
You wanna see a dead body?
There are exceptions, but in general, a Kohen has to be careful with being around dead people. And as we mentioned in last week's episode about the plant monsters, a dead body can transmit tumah, ritual impurity, not just by touching or carrying it, but also by being in the same room as it. So when I was looking over the Parsha to find threads to pull at and holes to dig, I initially skipped right past all of this stuff. I didn't think there was anything particularly weird there to follow, and I actually had a pretty good start on a rabbit hole about ice cream, which would connect with the holiday of Shavuos, which is mentioned later on in the Parsha. But before I went all in on ice cream, I asked a group of friends on WhatsApp if they had any suggestions, and one of them said, how about zombies, and how the laws of impurity apply to people who have come back from the dead?
The dead rising from the grave!
And I said, do you have a source for that? And they pointed me to a fairly modern source that basically became a reverse rabbit hole. I kept on following the sources backwards until I got to a story in the Talmud, and then from there I discovered a whole bunch of interesting stuff. There's actually a different Gamar that asks that question directly, about whether a person who used to be dead but then was brought back to life transmits impurity like a dead body. And it's really interesting and there's a lot of cool stuff about it, but maybe we'll get to that in a future episode. But the Gamar that I did end up digging into is about a sage of the Talmud meeting Alo Anvi, Elijah the prophet, in a cemetery.
You mean you're... That's right. I'm Elijah the prophet. You got a problem with that?
It's a fairly simple story, but it ends up raising a lot of different questions about how these laws of impurity interact with death that isn't quite permanent. So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts. If you're ready to see where that goes, let's dive in. Okay, let's start with the Gamar, which actually isn't about dead people coming back to life. But it does have plenty of weird ingredients right off the bat. So here's what it says. One day, Rabba bar Avua happened to run into Alo Anvi, Elijah the prophet, hanging out in a non-Jewish cemetery. Now, let me just note that this story takes place in the time of the Talmud, hundreds of years after the time of the prophets. So, Alo Anvi in this story is in whatever form he's in now, when he comes to your Seder or a bris. Anyways, the first thing Rabba bar Avua does is start asking him a bunch of technical halachic questions. But then I guess he realizes that the circumstances of this meeting are kind of strange, and he asks, hang on, aren't you a Kohen? Why are you hanging out in a cemetery? And then Alo Anvi answers that it's not a problem because it's a non-Jewish cemetery, and the dead bodies of non-Jews only make a person impure by direct contact and not by being in the same space. Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, there are different opinions about whether or not the body of a non-Jew is matame ba'oil, can transfer impurity through being in the same physical space. Apparently, Alo Anvi agreed with the opinion that they don't. But the biggest thing that jumped out at me about this story is the matter-of-fact statement that Alo Anvi is a Kohen. That didn't sound like something I knew from other contexts. So I jumped over to Sefer Malachim, the Book of Kings, to check out Alo Anvi's entrance. And he just kind of shows up. There's no background given for him, no family lineage. And Radak, in his commentary there, points this out and says that there are various different opinions as to which tribe of Israel Elio was from, and they all have their own proofs. So then where did this idea come from in our story, that Elio is a Kohen? Rashi tells us that it's based on a statement that's mentioned in a few different places in Midrash and also in Zohar, that Eliyahu is Pinchas. Pinchas was Aaron's grandson and he was a Kohen. But Pinchas lived during the time that the Jews were in the desert, and Alo Anvi lived hundreds of years later. So in order for Eliyahu to be Pinchas, something weird has to be happening.
Well, that's ridiculous. He lived hundreds of years ago.
The Midrashic sources that mention this idea that Elio is Pinchas don't explain the mechanics of how it works. They just say that Elio is Pinchas, or sometimes the other way around, Pinchas is Eliyahu. Usually that's interpreted as meaning that Pinchas lived for hundreds of years and then had his second act as Elio. But a lot of Kabbalistic sources explain it with Gilgulim, reincarnation. Pinchas passed away, and then that same soul returned as Elio. But it seems like our story about Alo Anvi in the graveyard is looking at it the first way, that Pinchas in his original physical Kohen body was Elio, and that hundreds of years after he ascended to the heavens alive, he showed up in a non-Jewish cemetery to talk about halacha.
There are entities possessed of extremely long lifespans, virtually immortal.
Thus the question, hey, you're a Kohen, how could you be hanging out in a cemetery? And then the answer is because non-Jewish cemeteries are different. So when I was first looking at this story, the first thought I had was that it's strange to apply these laws to Alo Anvi in his current state at all. He is not a regular person. I mean, just the fact that he can drink a cup of wine in every Jewish home in the world in one night tells me he's not bound by the same rules as most human beings. Although, to be fair, it seems like by the time he gets to my house, he barely even touches it. Anyways, I thought it was interesting that the story doesn't acknowledge that at all and answers the question based on regular human halacha. But while I was digging through the commentaries on this Gemara, I saw that Tois Rid does kind of address it. He's answering a question that he apparently asked in an earlier edition of his commentary, which is that Elio only explains why being in the same space as the body of a non-Jew isn't a problem for a Kohen. But what about direct contact? That should still be a problem. And apparently cemeteries were a little bit sloppier 2,000 years ago, and there would be a risk of stepping on a bone or something like that.
Affirmative. I poked one, it was dead.
So then, why wasn't Alo Anvi concerned about that? And the Tois Rid answers that it makes sense to him to say that Alo Anvi in his current state is a malach, an angel, and therefore he was hovering above the ground, in which case there would still be an issue of being in the same space as a dead body, but there wouldn't be a risk of physical contact. So what I thought was particularly interesting about this is that even though it does address the idea that Alo Anvi is no longer a regular human being, it doesn't use that alone as a way out of the entire problem. It seems like the assumption is that even an angel who's also a Kohen would still be bound by the laws of ritual impurity. The only difference is that he can fly.
He can fly! He flew!
So I thought that was cool. Okay, so a lot of interesting stuff so far, but no zombies yet. But that's where Tois comes in. When the Gamar raises that question about how Elio could be hanging out in a cemetery, that's when Tois chimes in with a seemingly even bigger question about a story in Sefer Malachim, the Book of Kings, where Elio comes into direct physical contact with an actual dead person. But before we get to that question and answer, let's look at the story. So Alo Anvi was staying in the home of a widow, and her son got very sick and he passed away. Obviously the woman was very upset, and she started yelling at Elio. And Elio took the boy, and he laid down on top of him 3 times, and asked Hashem to please restore the soul of the child within him. And Hashem heard Elio's voice, and the soul of the boy was restored, and he came back to life. So, first of all, awesome story. But we're in Tois land right now, which means we've got to ask technical questions about everything. And the technical question on this story is that if the Gemara says Elio is a Kohen, then how could he have touched the body of this boy who had passed away? So Tois answers that Eliyahu was certain that he could bring this boy back to life. And since he was certain of that, then it became a case of pikuach nefesh, saving a life, in which case you can do whatever you have to do. So what's cool about this to me is that usually the possibility of saving a life is gone once the person dies. It's a life or death situation until the person dies, and then it's just a death situation. But in this case, because Elio was a Navi, a prophet, and he knew that he could ask Hashem to bring the boy back to life and then it would work, then it went back to being a case of saving a life again. So I guess what I like about this is the interaction of technical halachic parameters with supernatural conditions and how that would create unique applications of the laws. But there are actually a lot of questions on this Tois. I'm not going to get into all of them here, but there was one problem with this answer that was pointed out by Radbaz in a tshuva, or responsum. Somebody asked him that same question from Tois, how Alo Anvi could have touched a dead body if he was a Kohen. And he goes through a bunch of possible answers, and when he gets to Tois's answer about pikuach nefesh, he says, first of all, there's a principle in Torah that we don't rely on miracles. So if the entire premise of Alo Anvi's exemption from the impurity rules was that he could bring this boy back to life through a miracle, then he shouldn't have been able to do it. You can't rely on that. But then he points out another problem. If Elio was certain that he could bring the boy back to life, then it wasn't a case of pikuach nefesh, saving a life anymore, because there was no risk. He knew he could do it, so the emergency is gone, and he's not exempt from the impurity rules. But if he wasn't certain that he could bring the boy back to life, then there's no pikuach nefesh. It's not a case of saving a life because the person is already dead. So what I love about this is that there are multiple levels of loops here. And as I've said many times in this series, I love loops. First of all, there's the main loop. If he's certain that he can do it, then there's no risk. But if there is a risk that it won't work, then he's not certain, in which case it's just a dead person and not a risk of death. It's all very confusing. But then there's another layer. If Elio is certain that he can bring the person back to life, then there's no risk of death and he can't do it. But if he can't do it, then there is a risk, so then he can do it, in which case there's no risk, so he can't do it. Very loopy, very fun.
An infinite loop? I don't have time for that.
Okay, so when I was digging around for stuff about that Tosfos, I found an interesting take on it in Tus Yakov, which is an early Hasidic work by a student of the Baal Shem Tov. And we'll get to that in a minute. But that source led me to a midrash that explores another interesting facet of how the laws of impurity apply to someone who isn't human. The midrash says that Hashem's love for the Jewish people is illustrated by the fact that Hashem was revealed in a place of idol worship and impurity, referring to Egypt, in order to free the Jews. And then it gives an analogy to a kohen whose truma fell into a cemetery. Truma is an offering from produce that everyone has to give to a kohen, and that was a big part of the livelihood of the kohanim. So this kohen drops his truma in a cemetery, and now he has a problem. He thinks to himself, I can't make myself tummy impure by going into the cemetery, but I also don't want to lose my truma. So he decides it's better that I become impure once and not lose my truma. I don't know what the actual halachas are in a case like this, but let's just take this analogy as it is. Anyways, the midrash then brings it back to God and the Jewish people, and says that Jews are Hashem's truma, and that's why Hashem went, so to speak, to an impure place to rescue us. So this is a fun midrash. I always like being told I'm loved. But it also raises a lot of interesting questions about what possible effect ritual impurity could have on Hashem. But that's not the question that Tois Yakov asks. He says that this whole analogy about truma and how we're Hashem's truma, all that explains why Hashem would be revealed in an impure place. But it doesn't answer for Moshe Rabbeinu or Moses. Now why would that matter? Moshe's brother Aaron was the kohen, not Moshe. But before Aaron and his descendants were appointed as the Kohanim, Moshe Rabbeinu was the Kohen. So then the question is, how could Moshe Rabbeinu, who had already run away from Egypt, go back there and make himself impure to save us?
Let my people go.
We're not his truma. And if you say, well, Hashem told him to, then why did Hashem tell him to? So that's the question. And the answer is based on that Tosfos about Alo Anvi touching a dead person to bring him back to life. Since Alo Anvi was certain that he could bring the dead person back to life, then it became a case of pikuach nefesh, saving a life. So Tois Yakov says, it's the same thing with Moshe Rabbeinu and the Jewish people. Since he was certain that he could rescue us, then it became a matter of saving lives, and he was allowed to make himself impure. So what I liked about this is that I've never really considered the possibility that Moshe wouldn't be responsible for taking care of the Jews. I just take it for granted that he was our leader and we were his people, and that was the deal. He has to do whatever it takes to help us. But this makes it sound like, at least in a certain context, that Moshe Rabbeinu's responsibility to do whatever it takes to take care of us was caused directly by the fact that he was able to. Which I think is something that I can think about in my own life when it comes to situations where I know that I have the ability to help someone, but I feel like, hey, that's not my responsibility. Maybe the fact that I know that I have the ability to do it makes it my responsibility. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. Just a reminder again to sign up for the DIY Rabbit Hole course. There's only a few days left to register at creativejudaism.com/DIY. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole, but I'm not completely certain that I can get you out of it.